Well, I mean, this is the very big problem. There actually is no alternative. Any working solution to the crisis in Ukraine has to have Russia as part of the solution, not as part of the problem. Russia is a very large trading partner. Russia supplies the bulk of energy for Ukraine, and Russia holds the bulk of Ukraine's debt, which can be going to default any time now. And if the West believes that this is something they can solve whilst having Russia on the sidelines, then they're very, very seriously mistaken. And this is why Western policy has been so ill-considered. Western political leaders have thought that we can push Russia out of the picture and then pick up the pieces of Ukraine and deal with it on our own. And that is quite obviously not possible. Even being passive, Russia will be a very major part of the problem. And if we keep antagonizing Russia and threatening with sanctions and insulting Mr. Putin, then they may not be passive, then they may be doing active damage to the process. So the West really has created a mess here that is now on our table and not on the Russian table. Well, a sovereign default is nothing to take very lightheartedly. When a private business goes into bankruptcy, it means the business disappears. It may disappear for good, or it may be reconstructed. Once the old debt has been wiped off, a new company may rise out of the ashes. And those are the rules of the game in the private marketplace. Now, for states and governments, it's a very different ballgame, because here you have entire populations at risk. And if the Ukrainian state goes into bankruptcy, that means banks will fail, the government will run out of money, foreign trade will not be possible because you can't have credit. It means wages and pensions will not be paid on time or paid at all, and the economy will go into a real tailspin. So this is not something to be taken lightly, and it's quite obviously that all parties concerned here, all those that have claims on the Ukrainian economy, will be reluctant to trigger a default. But according to all the rating agencies now, the markets expect that given another few months of accumulating crisis, default will no longer be possible to avoid. So Ukraine is really standing into very serious danger here. And it seems that this hasn't really dawned on Western political leaders. No, and this is exactly why Western policy on Ukraine and on Russia has been so ill-advised. The West has now ended up in a situation where Russia has larger claims on Ukraine than Ukraine has reserves. So Russia can technically call a default in Ukraine at any point in time it wants. Prime Minister Medvedev claims that Russia has claims on Ukraine of about $16.5 or $16.6 billion. Ukraine has $12 billion in reserves and $9 billion in debt. So you can do the math. It means that at any point in time, Russia can just trigger default in Ukraine. Now, for the West, this implies that if we're going to keep the Ukrainian economy alive, we have to pump money into that economy. But now Russia demands that every dollar pumped into the economy should go to pay gas debts to Russia. So what is happening technically, I mean, Ukraine now refuses to pay accumulated gas debts to Russia. And Russia has, according to the contract that Ukraine has signed, a contractual right to say that if you don't pay your debts, we will demand advance payment from June 2nd. So on June 2nd, otherwise we'll shut off the supply. So on June 2nd, Ukraine may be without gas unless they pay their bills. And the European Union is adamant now that Ukraine has to pay its accumulated debts. Then we can talk about the price. But until yesterday, as far as I've seen, Ukraine still has not paid the debt. So what is happening now is that the IMF is under pressure from Russia to force the government in Kiev to make sure that all incoming credit is diverted to the coffers in Moscow in order to pay for accumulated gas debt. And Russia is ratcheting up the debt, meaning that for a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, the IMF will have to sit by and watch how credits pumped into the Ukrainian economy are passed on to the Russian budget, meaning that we are strengthening Russia whilst debt owed to Russia will instead be owed to the IMF and the European Union, and none of this money goes to supporting the Ukrainian economy. So it really is a game without any prospects for Ukraine to pull out of this. Unless there is a deal struck between Russia and the West that we all need to come together and rescue Ukraine. But given the political situation today, I don't see any reasonable chances for a deal anytime soon between Russia and the West. And if there is no such deal, then default is inevitable with all the consequences that will have. It is all very, very disturbing.